Good morning, guys. Thank you very much for sparing some time. This is a very exciting opportunity for me to talk to two legends. Just for the record, for the people that may not have heard you guys before, how about a brief introduction from each of you, just to set the context. Dave, maybe you go first.
Yeah, hi, I'm Dave Broom. I've been writing about spirits in general for about 30 years now. Quite a lot about whisky, but a long-term rum lover as well.
Stephen, how about yourself?
Yeah, this Sunday title is Dr. Stephen Mullen. I'm a historian of slavery in the British Atlantic world, so I'm based at the University of Glasgow. So my interests are in Scotland's relationship with the Caribbean and slavery, the Glasgow West India merchants, known as the sugar aristocracy. So, of course, one of their big major imports is sugar and also rum. So this is sort of a byline, but I'm delighted to be speaking here.
I'm genuinely quite excited to learn a lot about this myself. I'm Peter Holland. My background is rum, but not necessarily with a historical context. So you guys are adding some real weight to this. So let's plow straight in on that. I mean, yeah, we've got this deep historical context. I mean, like rum in Scotland goes back a very long time. Maybe Stephen, you could set a little bit of a context to that, and then maybe just to preempt. There's a lot of talk about Glasgow. I kind of feel like I need to apologise to the rest of Scotland and the rest of the thing, but you know.
Never apologise for talking about Glasgow.
Well, Glasgow is actually leading the way on these conversations. But historically, I mean, of course, rum's it's made from the distillation of cane juice and by sugar. So it's tied up in two big major processes. It's tied up in imperialism in the Caribbean, English and then British, and it's tied up with the imposition of chattel slavery. So I think rum certainly distilled first by European colonists and African slaves. We think in the early 17th century Caribbean, perhaps Dutch, perhaps early English. I mean, certainly the big sugar specialists are the Dutch, first of all. I mean, absolutely, that's where the English take the expertise in Barbados, for example. But the English then have a big major empire. First phase, Barbados, Antigua, Jamaica, 1655. And these are the big first phase English colonies. Post-Union, after the Union with Scotland, we see other islands coming in, what's then known as the British Empire. So we've got Grenada, Tobago. These are second phase colonies, Dominica, St. Lucia. Into your third phase, British imperialism in the Caribbean, we're seeing Demerara, Berbice, Essequibo, which become, of course, Guyana and Trinidad. So these are three big phases, and I'm sure you are recognising specific types of rum here as I go along.
Mm-hmm.
but obviously, the major phenomenon, the major system is chattel slavery. This is an English system. It's developed in Barbados from 1661, and actually, African enslaved people become property. Chattel has its provenance in French. So it's tied up with this on the sugar estates, enslaved people, white European masters. Sugar production is really fairly brutal. The demands of the sugar cultivation means the enslaved labour, their life cycles, their lives, it's a really grim and brutal existence across the process of sugar. But we know that it produces the muscovado of sugar and ultimately the rum, which is distilled on the sugar estates. And these become, really luxurious commodities that are adding to, cultured lifestyles and across the UK, across Europe, but Scotland, and we've got this specific Scottish and Glasgow dynamic.
So Scotland's interest. So we need to start it sort of diving down on that a little bit specifically. Your thoughts?
Well, I don't want to get any blame in the English for all of this, but I mean certainly Scottish aspirations, or Scottish capabilities, I should say, in the 17th century do not match their aspirations. They're desperate for a slice of empire. They simply don't have the infrastructure, or the military or naval capability to do it. So what you see is empire by stealth, and you see Scots taking over some of the early English colonies, particularly Barbados. There's a Scottish presence in Barbados from the 1620s. We also know that there's many Scots Barbadosed. So that would have been indentured servitude by criminal penalty or religious exiles, the Covenanters, etc. So you're getting the lower ranks deported. So they're making up. They become red leg population in Barbados. So there's certainly strong Scottish connections in Barbados and Antigua, St Kitts, Nevis in the 17th century. What you're seeing there in Glasgow is, well, I'll probably come on to that next, but there's certainly a sugar industry growing up in Glasgow for the 17th century. I'll return to that in the next section. But certainly you're seeing the Union in 1707, the Union with Scotland and England, really, it removes the legal and political barriers. So it allows Scots to become involved with the already established and huge English empire in a major way legally. It's one of the lures, it's one of the Article 4 of the Union provided free access, provided Scots with free trade, and it also brought them under the protectorate of the Royal Navy, which was Article 5. So this was the big bribe, the Union. And we know afterwards then Scots really become the middle managers of the British Empire. We see them in the Caribbean, we see them as merchants, they're overseers in sugar plantations, they are bookkeepers. Most famously, Robert Burns was on his way in 1786, but he's actually the most famous Scot not to be involved with Caribbean slavery. He didn't go. He certainly booked 3 tickets in 1786. He was in the run from one of his ex-girlfriend's fathers, but he never went. But in the period he didn't go, 1750 to 1800, we think about 20,000 Scots did. So they're fairly prevalent, certainly in different islands such as Jamaica. And they're sojourners. They're known as sojourners, which is a temporary economic migrant. They're going out to the Caribbean, hoping to create as much wealth in as short a period as possible, and then they come back, hopefully, to purchase the big landed estate. I think very few of them would have survived, and even fewer would have become rich, but this is the dream. So the Caribbean is about quick, exploitative wealth based on the back of Caribbean slavery. So you need to imagine, we can only presume, though, that the connections with sugar and rum are being, they're every day, they're quotidian connections with Scotland and the Caribbean.
It's funny how a few of the terms that you've used sort of resonate in the modern era, and we maybe look to other countries and so you hear economic migrant, you hear that, and
right.
People have all kinds of different vibes on it, and amazing how we forget very, very quickly, relatively speaking, So Glasgow, I'm guessing geographical location sort of sets the scene, really.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a few different reasons why Glasgow becomes successful post-Union, but you're right, location. I mean, it's quicker to cross the Atlantic. That certainly provides an advantage, but also the ingenuity of the merchants, and I'll come on to them. So Glasgow is much more famous for tobacco, the tobacco lords. I don't see why this should be the case, and I'm currently working to shift that. Glasgow's got an economic dependence on sugar for a much longer period. So tobacco's only big for, say, 40, 50 years. The golden age of tobacco is 1740 to 1790. Sugar is important to Glasgow for the 1660s, when we've got the first sugar houses, the sugar refineries, and the merchant city. And the golden age of sugar lasts right up to 1838. So the golden age, Glasgow's golden age of sugar, 1790, 1838, but it's going right back to the sugar houses in the 1660s. So Glasgow's certainly a sugar city. And this is why it's ironic, Glasgow's associated with tobacco, Greenock's sugaropolis, but Glasgow is the centre of the sugar trade. This is how it happened. And how important was it? Well, these merchants, they're known as they call themselves the sugar aristocracy. So these are the West India merchants. They're responsible for exporting, firstly importing Muscovado sugar, cotton, the rum, coffee. They export also the finished goods, which are textiles, finished goods like that. So there's a two-way relationship, and obviously they're sending out young men as well. The sugar aristocracy and the sojourners that I've already mentioned, some of them are creating large fortunes, and then they're sinking it into industry, into country estates, banking. There's a big major economic triple stimulus here. I would say that sugar's probably, it's not a great stimulant to Scottish economic development, but I would say the other, I would say definitely cotton is, at least in the first phase of the Scottish Industrial Revolution. It's providing major employment, whereas in the 17th and 18th century, sugar tends to be small-scale enterprises. But it changes, obviously, in the 19th century, and we'll come on to that later.
So how does sugar, forgive this sounds like a silly question, but how does sugar become, a sugar trade become rum? Because I don't think of sugar as being, and for the purposes of people listening, I don't think of sugar as, we don't make rum from sugar. We tend to make rum from molasses or whatever.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, the rum. I also, when I was kind of looking up history of rum, I was always looking up history of rum. And then I think as soon as you begin to look up history of sugar, all of a sudden the research documents suddenly become a lot richer. So you've got molasses basically as a waste product that was just getting dumped into the sea in Barbados or whatever. And then all of a sudden, all the merchants realise, hang on a minute, we can make money out of this. So and then it begins to become refined. And I think it's quite interesting looking at what's happening in a whole number of islands, certainly in the 18th century, as they begin to almost like become special. And some plantations become specialists in rum rather than in sugar because maybe the rum quality is better or whatever. And in Glasgow, I mean, you've got 3 sugar houses, So the Wester Sugar House, 1667. They appear to be distilling rum about 12 years after that.
Right.
The Easter Sugar House was the kind of dominant player. But I agree. I mean, they're very, very small. But that was like tail end of the 17th century.
Right.
And then down Stockwell Street, which was the south, was actually set up as a distillery eventually by Milliken and McDowell, who became big merchants. And they kind of set up as a distillery first and probably a refinery second. And I think that they appear to be doing, and it's a bit vague, they appear to be distilling some rum, but also set up to be distilling probably whiskey and various other things.
Right.
There's evidence that there's one kind of I love a little evidence. I think this is them just like talking up their own product, saying it is indistinguishable from the finest of French brandy. And there were a few wee tax breaks for them for domestic. And it was small scale, but a few wee kind of tax breaks are taking place there. Well, I agree. Some of it would have been sold as rum and distilled as rum, kind of because molasses were coming over, or the end of the muscovado, the sugar.
Aye.
And some then would have been used as a colorant or as an adulterant. So French brandy was coming in. You've got this rum, and it would then be redistilled. So for me, looking at those records, you've got a small amount of probably Scottish rum, if you want to call it that. Right. And then you've got the distillate from just the skimmings and everything of the sugar making process, lower quality, but which then would have been used in various other ways.
What you need to remember as well, you're definitely right, and you need to remember before 1776, with the outbreak of the American War, the Caribbean to trade with North America, and they shipped the rum up there. But after, of course, America leaves the British Empire, then that relationship is over, and it begins some economic distress for the planters. They want that relationship back. They're sending rum up to North America. They're getting timber in return. Mm-hmm. After that, it changes, and this is why it's one of the reasons why you're seeing certainly the rum imports increasing in Glasgow's golden age of sugar, because there's a new market for it. It's not as profitable, I don't think, afterwards into the 19th century for the Caribbean planters.
No, probably not. And you begin to see this kind of big shift taking place, simply because of the way that sugar was produced, and you see Barbados kind of being the capital of sugar. And then that declines and Jamaica takes over, and Jamaica kind of declines a little bit. And then you're moving into San Domingo,
that's the story.
And that declines, and then Cuba takes over. So it's this kind of wave upon wave upon wave. And, and my interpretation of it, and I'm probably wrong in this, is that once the sugar begins to decline, the sugar industry in all these islands begins to decline, they've hit their peak. and then they're kind of moving down, and eventually moves down to Guyana as well. Maybe a rum comes in on the back of that, so they're making less money from the sugar, but they've still got sugar, and suddenly rum then becomes maybe a more significant export for some of the planters than sugar had been. Well, I don't know. That's just a
no. I mean that's. I mean, you're right. I mean, what you're describing the story, the English and British sugar jewels in the crown, if you like. You know, Barbados is the major 17th century colony, and then it's Jamaica, and then into your third phase. You know, Demerara, before the abolition of slavery in 1834. You know, is major. So with the sugar production increasing and major import enslaved people, then you're also seeing the byproduct increasing as well.
I suppose the other thing that shocks me really is that, you know, as I was been brought up in Glasgow,
right,
it was never mentioned. You know, if slavery was ever mentioned in context of Scotland, it was, well, the English did it. And we were the ones who we were the proud abolitionists, and Glasgow wasn't a slave port, but Glasgow was built on the back of slavery.
Well, that was the first book I wrote. It wasn't us.
Aye.
And there's various different denialism around it, but certainly you do see it. I mean, in 1990, Glasgow could name a historic quarter of the East End the Merchant City. They don't call it Slave Merchant City. They didn't call it Slave Produce Merchant City. So what type of merchant city was it? Certainly, we'll come on to that later, but there's certainly a much greater awareness now about this history. And I think the Caribbean has been particularly submerged, particularly Tom Devine's work on the tobacco laws. You know, everybody just associated Glasgow with tobacco, but now we're realising the Caribbean's a much more profound relationship here. These West India merchants, and as we say, it's that 200-year period sugar really influencing. So we're waking up to it now.
But like Scotland and Jamaica have a strong connection. And I mean, you only need to look at the geography of the island. You see some of the names of the estates and things to see that connection. So it's worth kind of exploring a little bit of, I mean, yeah, we various ones suggested, but Hampden, for example. I mean, that's a very well-known name in the rum world.
Well, I'll probably contextualise Scotland's slavery relationship first. I'll be able to put Hampden into that context. But Scotland's relationship, I mean, probably going back to your point, Dave, about you know it wasn't us, and why was that relationship not interrogated much more fully? I think one of the reasons is, I mean, Glasgow certainly, or Scotland overall, it's got relatively limited involvement in the triangular trade. So there's only 31 recorded voyages, we think, between 1706 and 1766. I mean, it'll probably be more, but we don't have the records. This is tiny. I mean, if you think of 31 voyages, that would have went for Liverpool in 1 year. So tiny. So obviously the triangular trade, ships leaving British ports, Africa, picking up enslaved people, Middle Passage across the Atlantic, then the enslaved people would be sold in either the Caribbean or North America. The produce would come back, cotton, sugar, and rum. So Scotland, as I mentioned, there are only 31 of these voyages, but where Scots seem to have got off the hook is they had much greater involvement in plantation slavery. And you mentioned Jamaica there, that's certainly one example. In 1774, we think a full 1/3 of the white population are Scottish. And when you think that Scots are only 10% of the British population at the time, you're getting an understanding they're disproportionately overrepresented. I think it would also be the case in Tobago, also been the case in Grenada, some of these smaller leeward islands. I mean, Tobago is known as a Scotch colony. We also know that Demerara is polluted by Highlanders, you know, so the Highlanders are going over there in a big major way, and you're perpetuating these connections. We can also measure it as well when slavery is abolished in 1834. We think Scots are compensations awarded to the slave owners for the loss of their property, which is of course enslaved people. But Scots, again, 10% of the Brit population, but taking about 14% of this money, £20 million compensation was given. Scots are taking a disproportionate number. So we can start measuring this, we can start quantifying this, this relationship. But Jamaica and Hampden is that's the big major island, and Hampden acts as a microcosm. Go back, I can speak a bit about the Stirling Zakir. I mean, they're typically what's known as gentry capitalists. So they're a landed family. They've got a country estate, Keir and Cawdor. So they're very wealthy. But the James Stirling in the 1730s, he's a very busy laird because he has 22 children. And he sends, 22. He sends too many, but he's sending all his sons out to Jamaica. I mean, this would have been a normal path. You would either, the sons of the gentry, there's only the eldest son who would inherit the estate. The younger sons tended to enter the military or the colonies. I mean, that's the path. So he sends his young sons out to Jamaica in the 1730s, and they acquire Frontier in Hampden. Two estates, so they're in the family for the 1730s. I think actually that they're supposed to be unprofitable initially, these estates, but by later, I mean, I've looked at some of the records. I mean, they're producing £5,000 a year. I've been through some of the primary records. I've looked at, the slave inventories. They're sending rum back. They're sending sugar. I mean, we did a project a couple of years ago with the Mitchell Library, so these are digitised and certainly online. You can have a look at Hampden. And as you know, Dave, that David Heyman's programme a couple of years back, they actually went out to Hampden.
Yeah, no, it's great. I mean, it's one of these ones that when I first went to Jamaica, thinking Hampden, hang on a minute, and it's one of these kind of light bulb moments. You're driving through and you recognise these names, and you're kind of beginning to build up connections, and suddenly Hampden, because Hampden and Glasgow.
I'm not so sure if it's the stadium, but I mean, it might be. Who knows?
Yeah, I know, and it's extraordinary looking at it, because obviously Hampden, and I think Hampden's a really useful one for rum lovers as well, because Hampden's now a deservedly cult brand. It's the flag bearer for traditional Jamaican pot still rums, and then you look at the Stirlings of Keir and their involvement at both ends of the trade, so they're merchants in Glasgow and they're plantation owners, and suddenly it just becomes real and becomes alive. So I think it's a great one to, if we're beginning to have this conversation, which we should be having, it's a great example to talk to rum people about it, because suddenly it's real. You've got a bottle of Hampden, right? Okay, here's the history of this estate, and I was looking at that amazing digitised archive that you've got there. Also at the family website, and the family website is really interesting, because I'm just going to kind of quote very, very briefly from it, and it kind of says, involvement begins in the 18th century. The Stirlings had high hopes that their Jamaican estates would be extremely profitable. The harsh working environment, riots and insurrections, because Frontier was where the first slave rebellion started, they were attacking, ensured that the estates were never as profitable as they'd expected. And the emancipation of slaves, and this is extraordinary, this is a contemporary website. The emancipation of slaves, which occurred in 1833, quickly made the estates unprofitable, but they banked almost £4,000 for the 229 slaves that were at Hampden. Overall, they picked up equivalent today, 1.5 million for the slaves that they had in Jamaica.
But actually, within Glasgow, there starts to be a drinking kind of connection with rum, and this is probably the angle that I'm more familiar with. But if I had to connect rum and Scotland, this is the bit that would spring to my mind. Yeah,
well, certainly the consumption of rum certainly has. I mean, it's got a major social element then and now, and it's consumed in some of the club's records that I've looked at. The Pig Club, which is the major West India club, also the Gaelic Club of Gentlemen, which it demands attendees wear tartan, and if they don't, they need to pay the penalty, which is a bottle of rum. Nothing sums up this Caribbean, West India, Glasgow mentality, Highland mentality better than this club. But certainly the consumption of rum, it reinforces group cohesion and trust amongst business and political associates. And we also know this wider mentality. So certainly rum would have been consumed in private households as well as clubs. And I looked up one of the inventories. So Richard Denniston, who was in Kelvin Grove Mansion, the site where the Kelvin Grove Museum is today. So his most expensive item in his house was alcohol, 10% of everything he owned. So the single most expensive commodity, it was 24 dozen bottles of Madeira, 19 dozen port, 11 dozen sherry, a dozen rum, 18 bottles of cherry rum, 3 gallons of whiskey, 12 dozen porter, 6 dozen strong ale. So, I mean, that's some party. You're seeing different parts of it there. You're seeing, you know, there's the more refined part with the Madeira, but certainly the major amounts of rum for a big group events. And we know that the Glasgow Punch is famous. It's mixed up with the Glasgow Sherbet, which is effectively lemonade, cold water, sugar, lemon and limes, and mixed up in the bowl. Definitely a male drinking element to this. Women had to leave the room when they would say get the bowl. And the men, or probably servants, would mix it up in the correct proportions. And it becomes quite ritualistic, getting the correct portion. Also the toasts. And the toast that I discovered was to the trade of Glasgow and the outward bound. So, I mean, this is obviously the West India trades, we know that, but the outward bound is the young men. That's how I'm interpreting it. It could also be the commodities that are being sent out.
There's also there's the allure of the imported. That, you know, by the time you're getting into the 18th century, Scotch whisky, you know, people aren't really drinking Scotch whisky in an urban environment. You know, it's very much kind of Highland thing. You know, and if you're wanting to show you've got a certain degree of middle class respectability, you're going to be drinking something imported. So it's going to be brandy, and it's going to be Madeira, and it's going to be sherry, and it's going to be rum. You know, so and there's you know, as it begins to kind of filter down, even as if the merchants aren't necessarily drinking rum all the time, the fact that you have the sugar aristocracy certainly means that anybody coming up in Scotland and anybody kind of wanted to say, well, I've made it in some way, is going to try and copy what their betters, for want of a better term, are going to be drinking, and that then becomes rum. So it begins to kind of permeate Scottish society, especially Glasgow society, I would say. You know, I after that, simply because, you know, there's just the allure of the imported, and it has a prestige that locally produced spirits don't have really until the tail end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century. You know, rum was kind of the gold standard at that point. But also, from a whisky point of view, you've got an effective ban on distillation in the Highlands from the tail end of the 18th century into about 1823. You know, so suddenly you've got, you know, even if you wanted to drink whiskey, it was quite hard to get because, you know, it was going to be moonshine. But, you know, I mean, I was also looking at, you know, the Glasgow and its clubs thing, and there's a lovely quote from the Gaelic Club as well of a remarkable turtle feast which was held on the 18th of July in 1799. No one rose from the table until the whole was washed down with many hours uninterrupted flow of that universal beverage called Glasgow Punch, you know. And then you go to the People's Palace, and there's the Saracen's Head Punch Bowl that's still there, and you know, Glasgow Punch was famous. You know, it's the first great account of social drinking in Scotland, really.
Right, wow.
Is over punch, really. You know, everything else is, you know, oh yeah, there's wine, there's this, there's that. But if you really look at the social records of what people in Scotland were drinking at that period of time, it's punch.
You hinted a little bit, Dave. You said about sort of rum as whiskey's big brother. Really, I mean, you know, I love the idea of talking to a Scottish nation, saying like, well, rum, you know, that really is it. You know, I mean. You know, is it true to say that that maybe rum led the way in terms of well, I suppose the production, that people learn, other industries learn from people making rum?
Absolutely. I think, you know, if you go back to like Martin's account of A Planter's Guide, and you look at the way in which he specifies, he kind of sets up this university of rum. And it looks at looking at the way in which rum was produced. This is the beginning of the 18th century, about cold distillation, long fermentations, the use of dunder, you know, to stabilize fermentation, you know, and and the ways to kind of get around the whole funky thing, which has been, for hundreds of years. And you look at absolutely everything that's within that template for quality distillation, and you think, well, that is exactly what distillers are talking about now. And it's certainly not what distillers in Scotland were talking about when we're talking about whiskey. It might have been intuitively understood, but this is written down. And also, I think really importantly, because rum had to be shipped from the Caribbean across to Scotland or across to the UK, you begin to get an understanding of maturation. Rum becomes popular once it begins to be shipped across the Atlantic, because that hot and hellish liquor that we always talk about was suddenly transformed over a sea passage into something which was of high quality and different. Different color and different flavor and more complex. And again, if you then kind of look at shippers' records by the tail end of the 18th century, you look at the equivalent of Harper's, your sales manuals. You're getting 10-year-old Jamaican rum being offered for sale. So merchants are beginning to understand that the longer you keep it in the cask, the more the flavors are going to change. So to encapsulate all of that, you're looking at distillers in the Caribbean, and probably the ones who are beginning to specialize in rum, really looking very, very hard at how to make it better quality through fermentation, through distillation, through maturation, etc. Everything which is then learned by the Scotch whisky industry, once that begins to kick off properly in a commercial point of view in the 19th century. And you look at Dunder. Dunder is sour mashing. It's a rum technique which was then picked up by the bourbon industry. But Victor's right, the history. And because whiskey, whether that's Scotch whiskey or bourbon or whatever, it suddenly became the dominant player, and rum fell away significantly by the end of the 19th century. That area of rums and rum expertise is lost. You look at the great manuals by Ray or whoever, the 19th century. Extraordinary scientific papers written about rum production. And kind of finally, with regard to Scotch blending, what were the great grocer blenders of Scotland blending before they were blending Scotch whisky? They were blending tea and they were blending rum. So rum blends appear 20, 30, 40 years before Scotch blends arrive. So, by the middle of the 19th century, Scotch whisky was number 3 in Scotland in terms of popularity. Number 2 was rum, number 1 was Irish whisky. And blended Scotch comes up as there's a challenge, because all of a sudden all this whisky that is getting produced in Scotland isn't necessarily popular because it's not consistent and it's not of high quality. Rum and Irish whisky were still considered higher quality, and blends came in off the back of that, and blends are learned from rum. So yeah, that's big brother.
Why rum? Why did it start to fade from the public's perception, do you think?
I'm still trying to get. Yeah, I think there's the inevitable, there's the incredible entrepreneurial spirit of the Scotch blenders, of the John Walkers and the Shivers brothers and the Dewar family, etc., beginning to kind of understand what the possibilities of branding. It's the tail end of the 19th century, possibilities of branding, and also the access that the British Empire gave. And I think also at the same time, you're beginning to see a loosening, and Stephen, please correct me on this one, but maybe merchants not beginning to see the Caribbean as the great, the guaranteed money-making machine that had become.
End of slavery then, right? End of slavery.
Yeah, and the end of slavery. So suddenly, the importance of that Caribbean trade begins to slide. And because of that, all of a sudden, rum begins to slide. You've got the entrepreneurial spirit of the blenders beginning to take off. And certainly by 1880, when the great whisky historian Alfred Barnard did his big tour, in his introduction, he was saying hardly anybody is drinking rum. And he goes, and I don't understand why, because he knows it's of high quality, but suddenly fashionability, it's become, instead of a middle class popular drink, a drink of prestige, it becomes a working class drink. And certainly, when I was growing up in Glasgow, it was old guys sitting in the bar drinking drinking Navy rum. That's what it was. And
exception.
all of a sudden, the kind of social status of rum begins to slide all the way through the 19th century, and Scotch whisky begins to pick up. Yeah.
Well, you need to see the decline of the sugar aristocracy then as well. Slavery ends 1834, 1838. The mercantile classes are over. They're moving into the manufacturers' cotton. So that full Caribbean mentality that we've discussed in clubs, that's gradually coming to an end. And we also know that Glasgow's, after emancipation, Glasgow's the sugar centre probably up to the 1880s. I think then the Glasgow West India Association, they moved their sugar sampling room, which had been in the Royal Exchange, which is now the Gallery Modern Art. They moved that to Greenock in the 1880s. And as far as I can see, that's the shift.
That's
when it shifts. And then Tate and Lyle and that afterwards.
During the course of the day, we have a little Sugar House rum. It's a shame it's only a miniature. I should have a full-size bottle. And so we're talking about that kind of connection, brands in the modern era, harking back. Of course, we got Banditti Club, which is a name we talked about. The clubs, we didn't necessarily mention that one particularly. So there are these connections. So there is an awakening, I think.
Oh yeah, very much. It's really exciting, and Stephen, the work that you're doing is absolutely extraordinary. It's of huge help to me as a kind of drinks writer and drinks historian, and just uncovering this sadly ignored part of Scotland, especially these days. The work you're doing is absolutely extraordinary.
Thank you very much, guys. So that's completes part one. I'm looking forward to part two with Dave a little bit later on as we drink some rum. Cheers then, guys.
Thanks very much. Nice to meet you. Cheers.
Thanks a lot, guys.